Dear YouTube, in case you are investigating this video due to a complaint about hate speech or copyright violation, allow me to give the following assurances. Firstly, a word on copyright. If the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania is unhappy because I've used their propaganda in a way they disapprove of, please know that I am very familiar with copyright law and have ensured that any use of copyrighted material in this video falls within the fair use provisions, particularly as pertain to criticism and parody. Secondly, let me ease any concerns you may have about hate speech. Though I am unapologetically a critic of the leaders of Jehovah's Witnesses, I feel no hatred whatsoever when it comes to individual believers. I have even spoken out on occasion against the harassment and mistreatment of witnesses. Rather than being hateful, this video, and indeed my channel, represents my attempt at respectfully offering a helpful resource for witnesses who are beginning to think of their faith as false or harmful and would like to know the other side of the argument. Hello and welcome to my rebuttal of the September JW Broadcasting episode, which was hosted by governing body member Samuel Hurd and some other guy. Without further ado, let's roll the first clip.
The theme selected for my comments this month is punctuality, a godly quality. You might remember the opening paragraph in a 1990 Watchtower article on the subject of punctuality. It said that an elder's closest friends jokingly called him Armageddon. Why? They replied, "We know he's coming, but only God knows when." The elder had a problem with punctuality.
Now, apparently Samuel Hurd's been known to use this joke before about an elder named Armageddon because his colleagues knew he would be coming, but they didn't know when. I just find it extraordinary that something like Armageddon can be joked about in this way by believing Jehovah's Witnesses. They take Armageddon seriously as God's great day of wrath that's going to come and destroy everyone who basically isn't a Jehovah's Witness. But they're so used to the fact that they're so used to it being predicted as imminent. They're so used to the, decades of publication saying it's going to be any moment now, that it's now become just something to joke about. The fact that, we don't know when it's coming. It could be this year, it could be next year, it could be in 10 years, it could be in 20, we just don't know. Nobody ever puts two and two together and thinks, maybe it's never coming. By the way, I'm not saying it's impossible for there to be an Armageddon. It's perfectly plausible for mankind to destroy itself. We've had the ability to do that now for decades. But I do think, or I feel safely assert that Watchtower's narrative regarding Armageddon won't happen. It's a fantasy, essentially, but it's a fantasy that generations of Jehovah's Witnesses have been persuaded to buy into.
When Jehovah decided to destroy the ungodly world in a deluge, he said to Noah at Genesis chapter 6, verse 14, "Make for yourself an ark." Then at Genesis 7:4, Jehovah told Noah to enter into the ark and informed him, "For in just 7 days I will make it rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. What happened? A better late than never attitude? No, that is not acceptable to Jehovah. Instead, Genesis chapter 7, verse 10 says, "And 7 days later, the floodwaters came upon the earth." Right on time. Punctuality is a godly quality.
Jehovah may be a genocidal maniac, but at least he's punctual.
The Bible tells us to keep in expectation of Jehovah's future day of judgment. When will it happen? Well, to us it may seem that it has delayed, but what do we know about Jehovah? He is punctual, and so it is that Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 3 tells us, For the vision is yet for its appointed time, and it is rushing toward its end, and it will not lie. Even if it should delay, keep in expectation of it, for it will without fail come true. It will not be late. Punctuality is Jehovah's way. Unlike the elder cited earlier, this Armageddon will be on time.
How convenient that nobody knows or can know when Armageddon is coming, but what we can know is it's going to be on time. Jehovah's not going to delay with it. He's going to be punctual in bringing his mass slaughter of billions of people. It's going to happen. We just don't know when. So just, listen to us when we keep warning you about this over decades and decades and decades of our literature. But you don't get to call us out on that. You don't get to say to us, well, this is quite clearly not coming. Just trust us, it's coming.
Another aspect of punctuality is ending an assignment on time. In the interest of punctuality, let's move on to the next segment of our program.
Thank you, Brother Hurd. You are teaching by example. We appreciate that. And on the subject of punctuality...
So I've included this clip just to show you, in case you haven't watched the original broadcasting episode, just how awkward these episodes can be. Sam Hurd does this really, really awkward and uneven handover to Donald Gordon, who is the governing body helper who's co-hosting with him. And you can kind of tell why Samuel Hurd needs a co-host, because when you watch the whole episode, his manner in front of the camera, and particularly his failure to use an auto cue correctly, it just makes for very, very awkward viewing. Again, if you want to see what I mean, just watch the original video. But put it this way, if Samuel Hurd was just an ordinary rank and file witness who wasn't a governing body member, I struggle to see how he would be given speaking assignments in an average Kingdom Hall, because he just isn't a good speaker. I don't quite understand how he's getting to host the flagship JW broadcasting program when he's just not up to much as a speaker.
Now I have the privilege of serving in Bethel, and I can see Jehovah's hand in my life and also be able to give every day to him. This is the joy that I was looking for. So I would definitely encourage all young ones to really test out Jehovah. Like Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 1, my favorite scriptures growing up, that just give Jehovah, test him out, give him your everything, and you will see, you'll have no regrets. You'll have true satisfaction from serving him.
Young ones apparently will have no regrets, and they will have true satisfaction from serving Jehovah, which I don't need to explain. Serving Jehovah is basically serving the governing body. The governing body cannot in any way demonstrate that they speak for the God of the Bible. You have to take that on faith. So when young people are asked to pioneer, go to Bethel, do anything essentially by the governing body, they're not being asked by Jehovah. It's impossible for God to ask you to do something. They're being asked by the governing body. And this particular clip that I've just shown you is part of a testimony segment by a guy who has a problem as a young witness, has a problem with video games. And the video gaming becomes this huge temptation. He gets involved in an online community, and it all distracts him from his service to Jehovah. And an elder takes him to one side and basically tells him, you need to get your act together. You need to take the truth seriously. And hey presto, he becomes a pioneer and finally ends up in Bethel. And I found the whole thing about him now being a Bethelite, it takes me back to something I was saying in one of my recent videos. In fact, I think it was part 3 of the Don't Give Up series, in which I pointed out that Watchtower is essentially resorting to using more or less mostly Bethelites when they're doing these testimonies. They're literally kind of, when they're planning a video, kind of looking up, have you been on a video yet? No. Colin, have you? No, you have. Okay. Sally, how about you? It's just purely a case of reaching into this pool of people who have quite clearly invested their lives to serving Jehovah's Witnesses or Watchtower, and they need it to be true. And honestly, that part at the end about having no regrets, how is he going to say anything different? How is a Bethelite going to open up to you and say, well, actually, this had better be true, or else I've frankly wasted an awful lot of time?
Our lives are filled with spiritual activities. But our family worship hasn't exactly been regular. Maybe I fooled myself into thinking because we're busy doing things for Jehovah, it's okay to skip it sometimes.
Essentially, the point of this is to tell witnesses your family worship should be a regular part of your weekly schedule. So it's not enough for witnesses to regularly be going to meetings, regularly be going on the ministry, regularly be attending their assemblies and conventions. They also need to be doing their family worship sessions at home, and this includes couples who don't have children. So again, it's yet another area in which Jehovah's Witnesses are on this constant, hamster wheel of having things to do and it being almost impossible to keep up with all the expectations.
We're still busy in spiritual activities, but they are never an excuse to neglect our relationship. And now, we aren't just marriage mates. We're once again best friends.
So this was the touching conclusion to this segment, and I found it interesting how the voiceover says, well, spiritual activities are never an excuse for, ignoring your relationship, or words to that effect. In other words, family relationships come first. You can't use, your activities as an elder or as a pioneer to cause you to, neglect your basic family bonds. And I just cannot help but see the hypocrisy in that, coming from an organization that will end a family bond like that if there are any questions at all over loyalty or allegiance to the governing body.
There was a local needs part, and we'd try to do it every year. And this year it was in the perfect time because the next week we had the fire. And when the brother was reviewing, he was saying it was a high fire hazard year. So be prepared, and it was nice. The brothers were so obedient and took that to heart, and we're ready.
It just came to mind. During the local needs, the brother said, if in case of emergency, you have to follow direction. Listen to the local authorities and listen to your local elders.
So if you're following these JW Broadcasting episodes regularly, you'll know that it's a recurring theme, this whole thing about disaster preparedness and what to do if there's a natural disaster, or what to do if there's a terrorist attack. And aren't we such a fantastic organization when it comes to preparing people for these catastrophes? That seems to be a message that the governing body really wants to get across. And this particular segment's dealing with the recent wildfires in Alberta, Canada. You'll notice it opens up with these claims that, oh, well, wouldn't you know, there was actually a local needs item. And if you're not a Jehovah's Witness or you've never been one, a local needs item is a talk that's given in the congregation meeting that's specific to the needs of the congregation. That's why it's called local needs. So they're saying, oh, well, there was a local needs item and then the wildfires came. And that's how switched on, our brothers were, because they were warning us and they said, oh, this is a high risk year. And, they gave us this advice right when it was needed. And so we were so well prepared. Well, my argument, I'm repeating myself here, but you do not need to be a Jehovah's Witness to survive or to be able to deal with a natural disaster. And that seems to be the point that's being made. What would we do if we didn't have direction like that? What would we do if we didn't have that local needs item? This has to be Jehovah's organization because he's helping us in these situations. If you listen to the whole segment, you see that the municipality was putting measures in place. People were evacuated. Directions were given to the local populace. But there seems to be this very odd fixation by the governing body with making witnesses believe that actually it's Watchtower that you need to listen to. And listen to the authorities, but it's important to listen to your elders and listen to Watchtower because they'll have some advice too. Again, I can't quite figure out why it's so crucial to be a Jehovah's Witness and to have elders to listen to if you're in the midst of a natural disaster, because as was quite clearly obvious in the case of the Philippines disaster, Watchtower isn't always on the ball, and Watchtower does sometimes give awful advice. One example that's given in this segment of good advice that was given, they say, oh, well, the elders warned the congregation, the local congregation, to make sure their vehicles had full fuel tanks so that if there was a fire, they could get out of town easily and they wouldn't need to be involved in any mad dash for fuel. Yes, that's good advice, but again, you don't have to be a Jehovah's Witness to have those sorts of ideas and to take those kinds of precautions. And Watchtower certainly cannot say that their advice has a proven track record of being helpful when during the Philippines typhoon, they were actually letting publishers have meetings as the typhoon was making landfall. And there was a disproportionate loss of life. If you check my videos on that subject, there was a disproportionate loss of life among Jehovah's Witnesses.
Although we've lost everything materially, we have everything spiritually. What is gone is gone. What is important is our lives and our relationship with Jehovah.
So at this point, one of the guys who was involved in the wildfires and who lost all of his belongings and possessions, he says, what is important is our lives and our relationship with Jehovah. And this, for me, I found very, very frustrating because it's giving equivalency to the two. It's saying, well, our lives are important and our relationship with Jehovah. So if you're watching this as an outsider, I realize almost no outsiders are going to watch this. But if you're watching this as an outsider, you might be thinking, oh, well, at least they value life. But in truth, your relationship with Jehovah, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, should be more important than life. And there's no better way of illustrating that than the ban on blood. Because if you're a Jehovah's Witness and you're told by your doctor or your surgeon that you're going to die if you don't receive a blood transfusion, guess what comes first? Your relationship with Jehovah. You're expected to decline the blood transfusion and die in that situation.
To serve full time, that's been our goal. It opens up more ways to serve whole soul. So if not now, and if not here, this chance might slip away and disappear. So let's take the lead. Let's not hold back.
This was a really cringeworthy music video. Well, most of the music videos are cringeworthy. But the whole point of this is to encourage Jehovah's Witnesses to not hold back and to serve full time. And one of the interesting parts of just that clip that maybe you picked up on, like me, is where they're all getting into a car. You know, that's often what you do when you're a Jehovah's Witness. You organize yourselves into car groups so that you can go and, you know, call on people who've received the literature. Someone's got to pay for that car. You know, someone's had to fork out for the car, or they're having to pay for it in installments. You know, there are day-to-day costs that people need to pay for, but if you're a Jehovah's Witness pioneer, what comes first is doing 70 hours per month. That is your responsibility, and everything else, you know, is basically secondary. I always struggle to understand how witnesses can be depicted living in nice homes, driving around in nice cars, when the reality is that all of those things have to be paid for.
More than 1 million tourists were present at the Olympic Games in Rio de Janeiro, and among them were around 410,000 foreigners. In an effort to teach these ones about the Bible, Jehovah's Witnesses engaged in a special public witnessing campaign.
So this is a brief segment about the Olympic Games in Rio de Janeiro, and it's basically Watchtower saying, well, look, while the games were on, we had this big publicity campaign with the carts, and we made sure that people coming to see the games from all these different parts of the world, we made sure they had a witness. And at the beginning of the segment, you see these images of people diving into pools and people playing basketball, as though, hey, we're cool with sports. Sport's fantastic. If you're a Jehovah's Witness, type in competitive sports into Watchtower Library and see what comes up. I think you'll find that Jehovah's Witnesses are not pro-competitive sports, and arguably there are a few better examples of competitive sports than the Olympics. But when it suits Watchtower to at least make noises as though they're okay with it, that they will do it. Because in this case, it was an opportunity for them to preach to people from different nations, even though maybe you're familiar with some of the interviews I've done recently. I had Fifth on my channel, and he talked all about his experiences with the Metropolitan campaign, which is basically what this is, but he did it in San Francisco. And what he had to say about the effectiveness of the work was fascinating. He basically said that almost no one was interested in the work that they were doing. And over, I think it was a year or a year and a half period, something like that, he said out of the whole city of San Francisco, they only managed to get 2 people to become Jehovah's Witnesses. And if that's a year, you know, this is an Olympic Games. So, you know, good, you know, you do the math, but it just amazes me when you keep seeing these, this kind of material making a big song and dance about the car witnessing, but we're yet to see any actual evidence that it's more effective than door-to-door preaching.
We were at the cart when suddenly a police car full of officers stopped in front of us. I was worried they were going to ask us questions or make us leave. But then they got out of the car, came towards us, and one of them picked up the Bible Teach book, and without saying anything to us, told the others, "Didn't I tell you I was going to find them here? You can take these publications, they're free. These books will teach you amazing things."
So Watchtower has put together this segment on a preaching campaign at the Olympics. And out of all of the experiences that they could zoom in on and say, ha, this is our, you're going to want to hear this one. They pick this example of a car of policemen stopping and one of the policemen getting out and saying, see, I knew we'd find them here. These books are free. You're going to want to read them because they're amazing, or however it was related. That was the best out of the Olympic Games campaign in Rio de Janeiro. That was the best example they could come up with.
Over a year of planning went into preparing for this event and produced excellent results. Our international preaching work was made known to thousands present at the Olympic Games, and most importantly, it gave a great shout of praise to our God, Jehovah.
Of course, we're not going to tell you what the results actually were, but take it from us, they were excellent. So what we're now watching is a special comedy video that Watchtower produced years ago. I think they said 2014, and it was shown just to delegates at an international convention. International conventions are essentially opportunities to see a governing body member. I can't think of a better way of describing it. And, witnesses who are wealthy enough can sign on as delegates, and it means that Watchtower basically has to make or gets to make the travel arrangements, and it's very expensive, to put it simply, to essentially go on this trip where you attend a convention, you're seeing a governing body member giving the talks, and you're essentially treated like royalty if you're a delegate, and people put on shows. There's even been footage of line dancing in kingdom halls because all of the rules go out of the window when there's an international convention as to what can or can't be done on a kingdom hall platform. But anyway, this video was shown at a fairly recent convention, and it's called Knock Knock.
The title is Knock Knock.
And it's like a Laurel and Hardy black and white silent film that is kind of essentially, making fun of the fact that when witnesses go preaching from door to door, they could encounter anyone. They could encounter, as we saw there, someone who's very stern and unaccommodating and eventually ends up booting the guy off the porch. You then see him knock on another door, and it's this very attractive girl who seems very heartbroken when he runs away because he can't be alone with her. And I'm going to get to the final door that he knocks on. But just in this brief clip, you'll have seen a record. And the record has a picture of Joseph Rutherford on it. So Watchtower's president after Charles Taze Russell was Joseph Rutherford. Here's what I think. I find this fascinating from the point of view of someone who knows about Watchtower history. Because when you know about Watchtower history, you know first of all what kind of a man Joseph Rutherford was. I urge you, if you don't know already, to do a bit of digging there, okay? And then you also understand why they even had gramophones and sound cars, because it also shows the guy driving a sound car with speakers on it, which is not something that witnesses do these days. They don't park a car in a neighborhood and blast out JW Broadcasting because they know it would get them in trouble. But back in those days, they needed the sound cars and they needed the gramophones because essentially it was a time in witness history when witnesses weren't trusted to preach themselves. They weren't trusted to make the introduction to the householder. The only thing that they were trusted to do was relate Rutherford's words, whether it was through a sound car or whether it was through a record. So they would show up and they would literally have to say to the householder, do you mind if I play this record for you? And, you know, if the householder agreed, they would essentially get a sermon direct from Rutherford. And another reason why Rutherford needed to have himself broadcast on these records is because he'd been forced off the radio, which is another thing you learn about. But you briefly see this guy with a record, and it has, if you look carefully enough, on the record it says the word religion, and that means that the record was essentially an audio book version of the Rutherford book Religion, which I have. It was published in 1940, and again, this is where you need to know a little bit about witness history, because it's an odd title for a book, isn't it? Religion. And later on in this very video, you see the guy with a placard, holding a board, a sandwich board, saying, "Religion is a snare and a racket." Most witnesses are familiar with that expression. Religion is a snare and a racket. So this book was essentially arguing against religion. It was saying religion is a terrible thing. And just to show you, if you turn to page 18, it says, "The scriptures show that organized religion originated with the devil, who created and brought into action religion for the very purpose of turning mankind away from God. The scriptures also clearly prove that all the nations, including so-called Christendom at the present time, constitute Babylon, and all such practice religion, because the devil has deceived men and carried on his religious practice even in the name of God and Christ." So the point being, Rutherford is saying to people who read his book, we're not a religion. Jehovah's Witnesses aren't a religion, everyone else is. You can't call us a religion because we're all about true worship. And he made this odd distinction so that witnesses weren't to consider themselves as a religion, which is why you had religion is a snare and a racket. It was only after Rutherford's death and, you know, with the organization growing and having to deal with all sorts of legal issues that they kind of quietly moved away from we're not a religion to, yeah, okay, we are a religion. We're just the only true religion. So in this scene, the witness is feeling very downhearted, and it looks like he goes to look at his watch, and in so doing, he sees a piece of paper with the slogan, "Millions now living will never die." And this is where it starts to get a bit weird, because "Millions now living will never die" was the title of this book that was published in 1920. It was one of the first kind of proper publications that Rutherford wrote. 1920, whereas Religion, for context, was published in 1939. So quite a big difference in dates between the two. But anyway, apparently this chap from the late 1930s is carrying around 1920s literature. And he sees this slogan, "Millions now living will never die." If you're a Jehovah's Witness, I'd like you to ask yourself at this point, How did that slogan work out? How did that work out as a prediction back in 1920? That millions now living will never die. And by the way, that's not the only prediction that's made in this book. If you turn to page 88, I'm actually handling it quite delicately because this is one of the oldest publications in my collection. If you turn to page 88, it says, the chief thing to be restored is the human race to life. And since other scriptures definitely fix the fact that there will be a resurrection of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and other faithful ones of old, and that these will have the first favor, in other words, they'll be the first to be resurrected, we may expect 1925 to witness the return of these faithful men of Israel from the condition of death, being resurrected and fully restored to perfect humanity and made the visible legal representatives of the new order of things on earth. So just to kind of simplify that prediction for you, back in 1920, Watchtower was predicting that in 1925, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and other faithful ones of old, in other words, an assortment of Bible characters, would physically appear from nowhere because they'd been resurrected and would join in building a kingdom government on earth. That was the teaching. And I feel it kind of typifies the problem that Watchtower has when it kind of gets all nostalgic about its past, because it can only go so far with that. You know, it can make these kind of quirky comedies, these kind of Laurel and Hardy style affairs where it's kind of, oh, well, we had sound cars and we had records and it was all so wonderful. They can only go so far when it comes to actually talking about what witnesses believed back then, because quite simply, it was a different religion. And before you say, oh, well, that was old light, you know, the light's been shining brighter since then. Listen, did Jesus select Watchtower in 1919 or not? There's supposed to have been a period of inspection between 1914 and 1919, and in 1919, Jesus apparently selected the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society to be his faithful slave. And in the next year, they published this. In the next year, the year after Jesus has given the thumbs up, honestly, that's what you have to believe if you're a Jehovah's Witness.
Where are the dead? Would you wish that question answered according to man's theory, or to have the answers pointed out in the Bible? You will say man's answer would be only a gasp. And yet there is no truth more clearly taught in the Bible than that of the resurrection of the dead. If the dead are to live again, then they must be resurrected, and God has provided that there shall be a resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is a guarantee that all who have died must be awakened out of death and given a knowledge of the truth. All mankind were born in sin, and the death of the perfect man Jesus provided the purchase price for the right of man to live again, and in due time Jesus will awaken them out of death. All of the dead in God's due time shall be awakened out of death, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. The resurrection will bring boundless joy to those who obey God under Christ's kingdom. The obedient ones on earth during the reign of Christ will be given everlasting life on the earth in complete happiness and joy. Jehovah's way is always right and true,
Learn that way and live.
So this is the clip I'm going to end on, and you know, what can I say? I've talked about this before. This is one of the most disgusting elements of Jehovah's Witness theology and proselytizing. The way that grief is used, is weaponized, is used as a tool to pull people in. The way that the grieving process is hijacked. So that if you want to see Mummy again, well, you just need to listen to what this man's saying. And in fact, not just listen to what he's saying, you need to give your life to serving the organization that this man is president of. Because the words that we've just been hearing were, that's Joseph Rutherford speaking right there. You can go on YouTube if you like and try and find recordings of him. He would give these sermons based on his publications. This was his sermon for religion. That's Joseph Rutherford. And again, I would urge you, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, do some research into what Joseph Rutherford was like as a man. Just do some digging, see what you find. Because I wrote a chapter on him, and it ended up being the longest chapter in my book, The Reluctant Apostate. It ended up being the longest chapter because there was so much to talk about. You know, he never cohabited with his wife. That's one thing that we have today, is that if you're an elder, you should be living with your wife, you know, and if you're not living with your wife, there should be a serious reason for that. Rutherford never lived with his wife, and he never gave any reasons for it. But when you do some digging, you know why. So honestly, this is not a man in a position to be saying, I have, you know, God is giving me these answers and I'm now going to give them to you. He was no spiritual role model by any stretch of the imagination. And yet he convinced an entire generation, or multiple generations, because he took over the presidency in 1917, and it wasn't until 1942 that he died. So multiple generations were roped into his theology, and it was a very distinct theology, or it turned into a very distinct theology from that of Charles Taze Russell. He basically changed the religion in his own image. It's because of Rutherford that I would have problems with this beard if I was a Jehovah's Witness. He was a remarkable character in all the wrong ways. And yet here he was in 1940 promising people that if they only listened to him, they could see their loved ones again. And the bit that I haven't shown of this clip, or I'll show it now, is later on in the same comedy, if you can call it a comedy. The two girls are depicted as old ladies going through their picture book in the present era, taking a trip down memory lane about how they became witnesses and looking at old pictures of their family when they were all young. And you know, that alone, if you're a witness, just stop and think about that. I know this is a fictitious story, but we're talking about two old women who were roped into a lifetime of serving an organization with the promise that by doing that, they'd see their dead mother again. How did that work out for them? You know, how, and that's the thing about this promise. How is it falsifiable? How can anyone come along and say, actually, that's a load of nonsense? I can't say that. I cannot say, you know, what Watchtower, the promise that Watchtower's making is false, and here's why. You only get to find that out when you're dead, and when you're dead, you're not aware of anything. So you have to figure this out when you're alive, and you have to, again, it's not falsifiable, so you have to put the pieces together. You have to think, does this make sense? Does it make sense that I can cheat death if I will only follow this group of people in New York? Does it make sense that I can see my dead loved ones again if I'll only devote myself to the current incarnation of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society and its leaders? Does that make sense to you? Or does it sound like just the sort of thing that any religion could promise? And if you're going to say, oh, well, it's about faith, you have to believe and then you'll get rewarded for your faith. Any religion can say that. Any religion can say that. And quite frankly, if you meet, let's say you're going on the preaching work and you meet a Mormon, for example, who says, oh, well, I believe that in the 1800s, God revealed himself to Joseph Smith and he gave us essentially a whole new Bible that we need to read, and you should read it too because it's the Word of God. You're going to say to the Mormon, well, how do you know that? And the Mormon's going to say, oh, well, you just have to have faith. Anyone can say it about any theological claim, and that's where critical thinking comes in. So that brings me to the end of the September broadcasting rebuttal. Thanks, by the way, for all of the recent, I've been getting a lot of love recently, a lot of appreciative comments and messages of support. I'm sorry I can't reply to all of them, it's just impossible. But I do appreciate it. That's all I'll say. I do appreciate it, and so does Deanna. So thank you for that. I'm going to carry on. I'm going to continue with my work. It's important to me, and I feel as though it's making a difference. And yeah, let's keep on helping people think. So that's about all, I'm afraid. I hope you've enjoyed this video. As always, don't forget to subscribe for more videos, and thank you for watching.